The forward operating base fell silent when the radio crackled with a transmission that shouldn't have existed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II call sign, Raven 37, had been declared lost 20 minutes earlier, swallowed by a storm of anti-aircraft fire over the Helmand River Valley. The aircraft had taken catastrophic damage during a danger-close run protecting a pinned SEAL team, and command had watched her transponder blink out like a dying star. Yet here was her voice, steady and professional, requesting emergency landing clearance with hydraulics failing and half her control surfaces shot away. In the tower, controllers froze. On the tarmac, ground crews stopped mid-task. And in the Tactical Operations Center, the SEAL team leader who'd called in that final strike felt something crack inside his chest, because he'd already written the letter in his mind, already composed the words to explain why Captain Delilah Kine wouldn't be coming home to her 8-year-old daughter. The mystery wasn't just that she was alive. It was what she'd done in those 20 minutes of radio silence, flying a dying aircraft through terrain that had killed better pilots in better machines. The damage assessment would later reveal 17 separate critical hits, punctured fuel cells, severed hydraulic lines, a GAU-8 cannon mount torn half off its housing, and a tail section held together by cables and prayer. The flight should have been impossible. The recovery should have been fatal. But Raven 37 was inbound, and every soul on that base knew they were about to witness something that would be whispered about in ready rooms for decades. Delilah Kine had joined the Air Force at 19, 8 months pregnant and desperate to build something stable for the daughter growing inside her. She'd endured the sneers, the assumptions, the casual dismissals from instructors who saw a teenage mother instead of a pilot. She'd chosen the A-10 because nobody wanted it, the unglamorous ground attack workhorse that the fighter jocks mocked as a flying bathtub. She'd built her reputation in obscurity, flying missions that didn't make headlines, protecting grunts in valleys whose names nobody could pronounce. Her call sign, Raven, came from her habit of arriving when things looked darkest, and from her daughter Maya's obsession with the poem by Poe. The bird that speaks only one word, perched above the door, watching everything with eyes that had seen too much. Now those eyes were locked on a runway 8 miles out, visible through a canopy spiderwebbed with cracks, while her hands worked controls that barely responded, and her mind calculated angles that math said didn't exist. The SEAL team had been 30 seconds from obliteration when she'd made her first pass. Intelligence had called the valley lightly defended, an assessment that proved catastrophically wrong when the team hit their objective, and the hills erupted with coordinated fire. Rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and something worse, a mobile anti-aircraft system that Ney hadn't known existed in the region. The team went aground in a dried riverbed with no cover and no options, calling for immediate air support with voices that carried the hollow tone of men saying goodbye. Delilah had been on a reconnaissance orbit 15 miles north when the call came through. Protocol demanded she wait for the dedicated close air support package that was 12 minutes out. Protocol demanded she coordinate with the AC-130 gunship that was repositioning from another sector. Protocol demanded a lot of things that would have left 8 Americans dead in Afghan dirt. She rolled inverted and pointed her nose at the coordinates instead. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is not a graceful aircraft. It's 10 tons of titanium bathtub wrapped around a 30-foot Gatling gun, designed by people who understood that sometimes you need to fly low and slow and angry through hell itself. As Delilah dropped into the valley, she armed the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fires depleted uranium rounds the size of beer bottles at 4,000 rounds per minute. The sound it makes isn't a roar. It's a belch, a deep, grinding belch that announces the presence of American air power with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Raven 37 is in hot, she transmitted, her voice calm as Sunday morning. Friendlies marked with IR strobes, all targets are danger close, confirm you want this. The SEAL team leader, call sign Reaper 6, responded with 3 words that would haunt him: cleared hot everything. She came in 30 feet off the deck, low enough to see faces in the fighting positions, low enough that her turbofans kicked up dust devils across the valley floor. The first burst from the GAU-8 walked through 3 machine gun nests like the finger of God, each 2-second trigger pull delivering 80 rounds of armor-piercing hate. She pulled up hard, feeling the airframe groan, then rolled back for a second pass before the enemy could reposition. This time she pickled 2 Maverick missiles, the weapons dropping clean and tracking true to their laser designations. The explosions bracketed the riverbed, close enough that the SEALs felt the overpressure in their teeth. That's when the anti-aircraft system locked on. Delilah saw the launch warning illuminate her threat panel, saw the smoke trail rising from a position that shouldn't have been there, and knew with perfect clarity that she was in the wrong place at the wrong speed in the wrong aircraft. The A-10 is tough, but it's not magic. She dumped chaff and flares, broke hard left, and felt the first missile detonate somewhere behind her right engine. The aircraft shuddered like a dog shaking off water. Alarms cascaded across her cockpit: fire warning, hydraulic failure, flight control caution. She silenced them with practiced efficiency, her hands already adjusting for the new reality of flying a wounded bird through a shooting gallery, and brought the nose around for another pass because the SEALs were still taking fire and she still had bullets. Raven 3-7, you are on fire, say status. The controller's voice cracked with urgency. Delilah glanced at her right mirror, saw the smoke trail, saw the flames licking at her engine nacelle. She ran the math. The fire suppression system was automatic. The engine was still producing thrust. The SEALs needed 30 more seconds. She calculated, decided, committed. Status is mission first, she replied. Reaper 6, mark your northern targets. The SEAL team leader would later tell the story in a voice that didn't sound like his own. He'd talk about how she came back around while actually on fire, how she put a gun run so close to their position that they could see the brass casings raining down around them, how she didn't pull off until the last enemy position went silent. He'd talk about seeing her aircraft trailing smoke and flame as it climbed away, how they'd all stopped shooting to watch because they understood they were witnessing something that transcended tactical necessity. She'd chosen to finish the mission while her aircraft burned, chosen to make sure they lived before she dealt with her own survival. And that kind of decision revealed something about character that no amount of training could teach. The second missile hit while she was egressing. This one found her tail section, tearing through control surfaces and severing hydraulic lines in a spray of fluid that crystallized instantly in the cold air. The A-10 lurched sideways, and Delilah felt the stick go mushy in her hands. She had backup hydraulics. She had manual reversion. She had skills earned through 1,000 hours of flying an aircraft that nobody else wanted, and she used all of it to keep the nose from dropping while she diagnosed the damage. Right engine destroyed, left engine running rough, hydraulics failing, flight controls degraded to nearly nothing, radio damaged but functional, and 8 miles of hostile territory between her and the nearest friendly base. The smart play was ejection. The safe play was ejection. The by-the-book play was definitely ejection. But ejecting meant losing the aircraft, meant a search and rescue operation in hostile territory, meant risking more lives to save hers. And somewhere in Texas, a third grader named Maya was waiting for her mom to call after the mission like she always did, waiting to share some story about school or friends or the book she was reading. Delilah looked at the smoke-filled cockpit, looked at the controls that barely responded, looked at the mountains ahead and the base somewhere beyond them, and made the decision that would define her legend. She'd bring this broken bird home, or she'd die trying, but she wouldn't make anyone else risk their life for her mistake of being in the wrong place when the missiles flew. She aimed for the mountain pass and started climbing. The A-10 responded like a wounded animal, sluggish and unpredictable, demanding constant input just to maintain something resembling controlled flight. Delilah worked the rudder pedals, adjusted trim, played the throttle on her remaining engine like a musical instrument. She talked to the aircraft in whispers, encouraging it, coaxing it, promising it dignity if it would just hold together a little longer. Other pilots might have felt foolish, but Delilah knew that flying was sometimes about faith. Faith that the engineers built in enough redundancy. Faith that the maintenance crews torqued every bolt correctly. Faith that the universe occasionally smiled on single mothers who were just trying to make it home. The radio silence lasted 18 minutes. Command declared her lost after 15, the standard protocol when an aircraft disappears from radar in hostile territory without communication. They were already assembling the casualty notification team, already pulling her file to review next-of-kin information, already beginning the grim bureaucratic process that follows when a warrior doesn't come home. The SEAL team refused to leave their position, insisted on staying in the valley with eyes on the sky, as if their vigil could somehow will her back to life. Reaper 6 stood in the open, ignoring the remaining sniper threat, staring at the mountain pass where she disappeared, his fist clenched around the IR strobe he'd used to mark targets for her gun runs. Then, like a ghost materializing from legend, her voice came through. Any station, Raven 37, emergency landing, hydraulics critical, request straighten approach. The tower controller, a 22-year-old airman on his first deployment, forgot every bit of training and simply whispered, "Holy shit." His supervisor grabbed the mic. Raven 37, say souls on board and fuel state. One soul, Delilah replied, her voice still eerily calm despite the cockpit that was now filled with enough warning lights to run a Christmas display. Fuel state is complicated. I'm not sure what's leaking and what's still contained. I'd like to get this aircraft on the ground before we find out. She didn't mention that she had no flaps, no speed brakes, half a rudder, and a flight control system held together with hope and stubbornness. She didn't mention that landing at this weight without hydraulics would require a touchdown speed that would consume every inch of runway. She didn't mention that her right engine was currently on fire again, or that her left engine was producing thrust, but also producing sounds that suggested imminent mechanical failure. The base emergency response kicked into gear, crash trucks positioned along the runway, fire crews donning gear, medical personnel staging at the approach end, and on the tarmac, off-duty personnel began gathering, mechanics and cooks and supply clerks and desk officers, drawn by some instinct that told them history was inbound. The SEALs had commandeered a helicopter and were racing back, Reaper 6 on the radio demanding updates, his professional composure finally cracking into something raw and desperate. "She came back for us 4 times, he kept saying. 4 times while on fire. You get her down safe. You get her down safe or I swear to God." His threats trailed off because there was nothing to threaten, no one to blame, just physics and luck, and the skill of a pilot flying an aircraft that should already be scattered across a mountainside. Delilah cleared the mountain pass and saw the base spread below her, the runway a clean line of concrete that represented life and continuation, and the possibility of seeing her daughter again. She was 7 miles out, descending through 8,000 feet, fighting controls that responded with increasing reluctance. The checklist for emergency landing without hydraulics was extensive. She'd practiced it in the simulator until she could recite it in her sleep. But the simulator never included an engine on fire, never included battle damage to a dozen critical systems, never included the specific cocktail of failures she was managing right now. This would be improvisation based on fundamentals, flying by instinct and experience, trusting that 10 years in the cockpit had taught her how to read an aircraft's moods. 5 miles out, 6,000 feet, she lowered the landing gear manually, using the emergency extension system, and prayed the tires hadn't been damaged. The gear indicators showed 3 down and locked, but she'd learned not to trust indicators today. The airspeed was too high for a safe landing, but she had no way to slow down without hydraulics. She'd come in fast and hot and hoped the runway was long enough, hoped the brakes worked, hoped the tires held. Hope was doing a lot of heavy lifting in her survival calculus. 3 miles, 4,000 feet. The tower cleared all traffic, shut down the base, rolled out every resource available. The commander stood in the operations center, watching the grainy feed from the approach camera, seeing the smoke trail that marked her descent, seeing the obvious damage to her airframe. He'd flown A-10s himself in Desert Storm. He knew what it took to keep one flying when it wanted to die. He knew this pilot was demonstrating skill that transcended training, that came from somewhere deeper than technique. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. His operations officer pulled up the file. "Captain Delilah Kine, 9 years in service, 3 deployments, 400 combat hours, single parent, 1 dependent. Efficiency reports all note exceptional skill but," he hesitated. "Several comments about not being a team player, flies alone too often, takes risks that make commanders nervous." The commander watched the damaged aircraft on final approach, watched the pilot make minute adjustments with controls that barely functioned, watched a landing that was equal parts skill and suicide, and understood that sometimes the best pilots were the ones who didn't fit the mold, who thought different, who saw options where others saw only obstacles. "Get her file ready for an upgrade," he said. "She's going to need a new evaluation after this." On mile, 2,000 feet, Delilah could see faces on the ground now, see the emergency vehicles tracking her approach, see the crowd gathered at the flight line. She allowed herself a moment of emotion, a brief flicker of relief that she might actually survive this, that Maya might not grow up without a mother. Then she locked it away and focused on the geometry of landing, on the calculations that would determine whether she rolled to a stop or tumbled into a fireball. The runway threshold passed beneath her nose. She pulled power to idle, or as close to idle as the dying engine would accept. The aircraft sank toward the concrete with all the grace of a falling refrigerator. The touchdown was brutal. Without hydraulics to soften the landing gear, the impact rippled through the airframe like a gunshot. The tires screamed. The brakes engaged with whatever pressure remained in the emergency system. Delilah stood on the rudder pedals, working to keep the nose straight as the aircraft decelerated with agonizing slowness. 50 knots, 40, 30. The end of the runway approached with mathematical certainty. She pumped the brakes, felt them fade, felt the aircraft drifting toward the overrun area where soft ground waited to catch aircraft that couldn't stop. 20 knots, 10, 5. The rolled to a halt 40 feet from the end of the concrete, the nose pointed slightly left, the right main landing gear sitting lower than it should, the entire airframe radiating heat and stress, and the particular smell of an aircraft that had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Delilah sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, unable to quite believe the ground had stopped moving. Then the emergency response converged, fire trucks spraying foam, crews scrambling to access the cockpit, medics ready with stretchers. She popped the canopy manually and immediately started coughing from the smoke that had filled the cockpit during the descent. "Can you move?" The crew chief's face appeared above her, concerned but professional. Delilah unbuckled with shaking hands, suddenly aware of the adrenaline crash rolling through her system like thunder. "Yeah, I can move. Help me out. I need to call my daughter." They carried her away from the aircraft on a stretcher she didn't need, standard protocol for crashes and emergency landings. Behind her, the A-10 sat on the runway like a monument to violence, every surface pockmarked and torn, the smoke still rising from the engine nacelle, the wings riddled with holes that showed daylight through the structure. The damage assessment team approached with cameras and clipboards, already beginning the forensic work that would reveal the full extent of what she'd survived. The base photographer captured images that would later circulate through the military community, generating discussions in flight schools and tactical seminars about the intersection of skill and luck. But the moment that would become legend happened when the SEAL team's helicopter landed and Reaper 6 sprinted across the tarmac to where Delilah sat on the stretcher, oxygen mask loose around her neck, medics checking her vitals. He was a hard man, weathered by a decade of deployments to places where violence was currency and death was casual. He'd seen teammates killed, had killed enemies with his bare hands, had cultivated the emotional armor that special operations demanded. None of it prepared him for the sight of the woman who'd saved his team while her own aircraft died around her. He stopped 3 feet away, this professional warrior who'd never broken in combat, and tears simply started rolling down his face. "You came back," he said, his voice destroyed. "4 times while on fire you came back." Delilah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in the last hour, eyes that held the weight of decisions that would follow her forever. "You would have done the same," she said quietly. "That's what this job is. We don't leave people behind." The commander approached, his face carefully neutral, his career having taught him to hide emotions. But Delilah saw his hand tremble slightly when he saluted her, saw the way his jaw clenched before he spoke. "Captain Kine, what you did today." He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I've been flying for 25 years. I've never seen anything like that. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. It won't be enough, but it's what I can do." She nodded, too tired to process accolades, too hollowed out by adrenaline crash to care about medals. "Permission to make a phone call, sir. I promised my daughter I'd call after every mission." They set her up in a quiet office with a satellite phone, then left her alone because some conversations were sacred. Delilah dialed the number she knew better than her own social security number and waited through the international connection delays. Her mother answered. She'd been watching Maya while Delilah deployed, and the relief in her voice was palpable. "Oh, thank God. We saw the news, saw something about a pilot." "I'm fine, Mom. Let me talk to Maya." The transfer took seconds that felt like hours. Then her daughter's voice, bright and innocent and untouched by what had happened in the valley. "Mom, you won't believe what happened at school today. Jennifer brought her lizard for show and tell and it escaped and Mrs. Patterson screamed and—" Delilah closed her eyes and listened to the story about the lizard and the classroom chaos, letting the normalcy of it wash over her like rain after drought. She didn't tell her daughter about the missiles, about the fire, about the landing that should have killed her. There would be time for those stories later, years from now when Maya was older and could understand why her mother had chosen this life. For now, it was enough to hear her laugh, to picture her animated face telling this story about school and lizards, and the small dramas that compose childhood. "I love you, baby bird," Delilah said when the story wound down. "More than anything in the universe. I'll be home soon." "Love you too, Mom. Bring me something cool from Afghanistan." The call ended and Delilah sat in the silence, suddenly aware of how close she'd come to making that call impossible, to leaving Maya with nothing but memories and a folded flag. The weight of it crushed down on her shoulders, and she put her head in her hands and allowed herself 60 seconds of breakdown, 60 seconds of shaking and tears and the release of terror she'd suppressed while flying. Then she breathed deep, wiped her eyes, and stood up. There would be debriefs, investigations, meetings with commanders who would want to understand every decision. She squared her shoulders and walked out to face the bureaucracy of heroism. The story spread through the military community with the speed of wildfire. Video footage from the base cameras made its way to YouTube, grainy but clear enough to show the smoking A-10 on approach, the brutal landing, the emergency response. Within days, it had millions of views. Fighter pilots at Nellis Air Force Base watched it during briefings. Marine aviators at Camp Pendleton analyzed her decision-making. Navy instructors at Pensacola used it as a case study in crew resource management, even though she'd been alone in the cockpit. The comments section filled with speculation and admiration, with armchair analysts debating her choices, with veterans sharing their own stories of impossible flights and emergency landings that shouldn't have worked. But the real impact happened in quieter spaces. In a ready room at Bagram, a young female pilot who'd been doubting whether she belonged in combat aviation watched the footage and felt something shift inside her chest. In a hangar at Kandahar, a maintenance crew chief showed his team the damage photos and used them to explain why every torque spec mattered, why every inspection item was written in someone's blood. In an office at the Pentagon, a general reviewing pilot assignments looked at Delilah's file with new eyes and wondered how many other talented aviators were being overlooked because they didn't fit conventional molds. The formal investigation took 6 weeks. They interviewed Delilah for hours, reconstructed her flight path, analyzed the radio transcripts, examined every bolt and panel on the damaged aircraft. The maintenance report documented 17 hits that individually would have grounded most aircraft, and collectively should have resulted in catastrophic failure. The weapons system had been held in place by 2 of its 6 mounting bolts. The tail section had been missing 60% of its control authority. The right engine had been running on nothing but momentum and aviation fuel vapors. The odds of surviving the damage, successfully landing without hydraulics, and doing it all while maintaining radio discipline and tactical awareness were calculated by a statistician at Air Force Safety Center as roughly equivalent to winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived with ceremony befitting the achievement. The citation read like something from another era, full of phrases like extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety. Delilah stood at attention in dress blues while the commander pinned the medal to her chest, while photographers captured the moment, while other pilots watched with expressions ranging from admiration to envy to something deeper, recognition that they'd witnessed a standard being set that would define expectations for years to come. Maya sat in the front row wearing her Sunday best, not entirely understanding the significance, but knowing her mom had done something important, something that made strangers cry and officers salute. After the ceremony, while others networked and socialized, Delilah found herself alone on a balcony overlooking the flight line. She watched A-10s taking off for evening sorties, the familiar sound of the turbofans like a lullaby. Reaper 6 found her there, out of uniform now, looking more human without the tactical gear and war paint. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 people bound by circumstances that civilians could never quite understand. "I wrote 8 letters after that mission," he said finally. "Letters to families explaining what happened to their sons and husbands and brothers. I've written too many of those letters, but that day, because of you, I didn't have to mail them. Those men went home to their families. They got to hold their kids, see another birthday, another Christmas. That's because of what you did." Delilah shook her head slowly. "It's the job. It's what we sign up for. Someone else would have done the same." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. Other pilots might have waited for backup, might have followed protocol, might have ejected when the damage mounted. She'd made choices that day that revealed something about character, about the willingness to trade personal safety for mission success, about the kind of courage that didn't announce itself but simply acted when action was required. Those choices defined her in ways that no training could replicate. "My team wants to do something," Reaper 6 continued. "We want to establish a scholarship fund in your name for kids of single parents in the military. We figure if your daughter can grow up watching you do this, watching you be this, maybe other kids can see that example too. Maybe they'll know that you don't have to fit the stereotype to be exceptional." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death and were grateful for the chance to honor life instead. "Would you be okay with that?" She thought about Maya, about the struggle of balancing motherhood and military service, about all the times she doubted whether she was doing right by her daughter by choosing this career. She thought about the other single parents in uniform, the ones who felt invisible, who wondered if they could excel while raising kids alone. "Yeah," she said softly, "I'd be honored." The scholarship fund became real within months, seeded by donations from the SEAL team, from Air Force personnel who'd heard the story, from civilians who watched the video and wanted to contribute to something that mattered. They named it the Raven Fund, with a logo featuring a black bird silhouetted against a sunrise. The first recipient was a 19-year-old from Michigan, whose mother had served 3 tours as an Army medic while raising him alone, who wanted to study engineering but couldn't afford college. He accepted the check with the same tears that Reaper 6 had shed on the tarmac, and thanked a pilot he'd never met for showing him that excellence wasn't limited by circumstances. Years would pass before the full significance of that day crystallized into legend. Other missions would be flown, other medals awarded, other acts of heroism recorded and filed away. But in ready rooms and pilot lounges, in training simulators and combat briefings, the story of Raven 37 would persist. Instructors would use it to teach decision-making under pressure. Safety officers would reference it when discussing damage tolerance. And young pilots, especially women, would watch the footage and understand that the sky belonged to anyone with skill and courage, regardless of what doubters believed. Delilah continued flying A-10s until her daughter graduated high school, then transitioned to an instructor role where she could shape the next generation while maintaining more stable hours. She never talked much about that day in the valley, deflecting questions with professional modesty. But sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd think about the moment when she decided to make another pass while on fire, about the calculation that weighed her life against the lives of 8 men she'd never met. She'd wonder if she'd make the same choice again, knowing what it cost, knowing how close she'd come to leaving her daughter alone. And every time she arrived at the same conclusion, yes, because that's what the job demanded, because that's what her uniform meant. Because somewhere over Afghanistan, in the crucible of combat and fire and impossible choices, she discovered who she really was, not just a pilot, not just a mother, but someone willing to pay any price to bring others home. The she flew that day was never repaired. The damage was too extensive, the airframe too compromised. Instead, they preserved it as a monument at the Air Force Museum in Ohio, mounted in the position of attack, nose down, wings slightly rolled, frozen in the moment of commitment. A plaque beneath it tells the story in clinical language, lists the medals and commendations, provides technical details about the engagement. But the truth lives in the bullet holes that riddle the fuselage, in the tail section held together with replacement panels, in the scored and blackened engine nacelle. It's a testament written in metal and fire, a reminder that sometimes the most important missions are flown by people nobody noticed, in aircraft nobody respected, to save lives nobody remembers. Maya grew up proud but puzzled by her mother's reluctance to embrace fame. She'd watch the YouTube video sometimes. It had 20 million views by her 16th birthday, and wonder how her mom could be so calm about something so extraordinary. It wasn't until she was older, until she'd experienced her own failures and fears, that she understood. The heroism hadn't been in the landing or the medals or the recognition. It had been in the daily choice to serve, to deploy, to leave her daughter behind month after month while she flew missions in places where people wanted to kill her. The valley had been dramatic, but the real courage was quieter, the courage of showing up, of doing the job, of believing she belonged in a world that kept telling her she didn't. On a cool October evening, 20 years after that mission, a ceremony was held at the monument. Delilah attended with gray in her hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, retired now but still carrying herself with pilot posture. Maya stood beside her, a captain herself now, flying helicopters for the Army, continuing a legacy she'd never asked for but had embraced anyway. The SEAL team was there, older and slower but still dangerous, still brothers bound by shared trauma and shared salvation. Reaper 6 approached the podium to speak, his voice steady now, the years having processed the emotion into something he could articulate. "We talk about heroism like it's something rare," he began, "like it only happens in movies or history books, but I'm here to tell you that heroism is a choice made in the moment when everything is on fire and the odds are impossible and you have every reason to choose yourself. Captain Kine made that choice 4 times in one mission. She chose us over herself. She chose mission over safety. And because of that choice, 8 men got to grow old, got to see their kids born, got to build lives that wouldn't exist without her." He paused, looked directly at Delilah. "You gave us tomorrow. We've tried every day since to be worthy of that gift." The applause was thunderous, but Delilah barely heard it. She was looking at the preserved A-10, at the battle damage frozen in time, remembering the weight of the stick in her hands and the smoke in her lungs, and the voice of her daughter asking about lizards. She was remembering the moment she'd chosen to make another pass, the moment that had defined everything that came after. And she was thinking about all the other pilots making similar choices in similar moments, flying missions that would never make headlines, saving lives that would never know their names. They were the real story, not her, not the medals, not the viral video that had turned her into mythology. Just people doing their jobs while the world watched or didn't, while recognition came or didn't, while history remembered or forgot. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Maya pulled her mother aside, away from the admirers and well-wishers. "Mom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. I'm deploying next month, Afghanistan again, and I'm scared, but also," she struggled to find words for the feeling, "also proud, because you showed me how to be brave when being brave is the only option. You showed me that we don't have to be fearless, we just have to fly anyway." Delilah pulled her daughter close, felt the tears she'd been holding back for 2 decades finally break through. "You call me after every mission," she whispered fiercely. "Every single one. I don't care what time it is or where I am. You call me and tell me about lizards or whatever mundane thing happened that day. You keep me grounded in the normal while you're out there in the abnormal. Promise me." "I promise, Mom. I promise." They stood holding each other while the sun set behind the museum, while the preserved A-10 caught the last light and seemed almost alive again, while somewhere overhead another generation of pilots flew training missions and learned the difference between competence and courage. The story would continue, passed down through decades, refined and embellished and eventually mythologized beyond recognition. But at its core would remain a simple truth. When everything was on fire and death seemed certain, one pilot chose to fly back into the flames. And because of that choice, because of that moment of impossible courage, 8 men lived to tell their children about the single mom who's landed bullet-riddled but alive, and how even the SEALs held back tears when she climbed out of that cockpit and asked to call her daughter.